There's an old proverb that says, if you wear the wrong shoes, your feet will hurt. If you marry the wrong person, your heart will hurt for a lifetime. At first glance, it sounds like folk wisdom, simple, almost rustic. But beneath it lies a structural truth about human life. Shoes can be taken off. Marriage cannot not without tearing through an entire architecture of relationships, obligations, loyalties, and shared history. In Western thought, from Aristotle to modern family systems theory, marriage has never been treated as a purely private contract between two isolated individuals. It is a reconfiguration of social bonds. It redraws emotional borders. It creates a new gravitational center around which parents, siblings, and eventually children must orbit. So when a parent considers their child's marriage, the question is not merely, is this person kind, or do they seem compatible right now? The deeper question is structural. Is this a relationship designed to evolve through friction? Or is it a structure that defaults to withdrawal the moment tension appears? Because there are two fundamentally different relational architectures. One moves from misunderstanding, dialogue, adjustment. The other moves from discomfort, distancing, termination. Outwardly, both can sound reasonable, calm, even rational, but the difference is not in tone. It is in trajectory. This lecture is not about judging a future daughter-in-law. It is not about labeling someone good or bad. It is about something far more subtle. Not the content of what is said, but the direction of the response. Not the warmth of the smile, but the speed at which the relationship closes. If you can detect that direction early, you can often predict the long-term emotional climate of a family before the wedding ever takes place. Today, we will examine 10 warning patterns that suggest a relational mindset that defaults, not toward adjustment, but toward closure, particularly in the context of relationships with in-laws. Again, the issue is not whether someone is right. The issue is whether they are structurally open. 1. The smile that withdraws hope. You ask gently, after marriage, do you think there's a possibility you might grow closer to his parents over time? She smiles. She nods. And then she says, I just don't expect anything from the beginning. On the surface, this sounds emotionally mature. No expectations, no disappointment. But philosophically, this is not neutrality. It is preemptive disengagement. Hope is not naivete. It is relational oxygen. To refuse expectation entirely is to remove the possibility of growth before the relationship even begins. A person who defaults to, I expect nothing, may not be protecting themselves from disappointment. They may be protecting themselves from involvement. 2. The conclusion before experience. You ask, if conflicts arise about parenting or lifestyle differences, how do you imagine handling them? And the answer comes quickly. That's something you don't even need to experience to know. This is a cognitive closure. Instead of seeing future tension as negotiable, it is categorized in advance as intolerable. In conflict psychology, flexibility predicts durability. The ability to imagine alternative outcomes is what allows adjustment to occur. When someone refuses even to simulate complexity, they are not managing risk. They are eliminating engagement. 3. The refusal to bear discomfort. You ask, in families, sometimes discomfort is unavoidable. How much inconvenience do you think is reasonable to tolerate? The response, why should I have to tolerate that at all? Embedded in this reply is a premise relationships should not require endurance. But every durable social bond, friendship, marriage, parenthood, contains friction. If discomfort is treated as a violation rather than a condition of closeness, then withdrawal becomes the default remedy. This is not about promoting self-sacrifice. It is about recognizing that intimacy and inconvenience are often intertwined. 4. The language of disposal. You ask, when relationships become stressful, do you tend to work through them or step back? The answer: I cut off relationships that don't serve me. This language frames human bonds in utilitarian terms. While boundaries are essential, a mindset that equates relational difficulty with disposability transforms family into a portfolio of optional investments. In such a framework, maintaining connection is no longer a value, it is a cost-benefit calculation. 5. The generational generalization. You ask, do you see as parents as individuals or more as representatives of a generation? The reply: honestly, that generation is all the same. When a person becomes a category, empathy collapses. Once someone is reduced to boomers, traditionalists, or old people, relational nuance disappears. Prejudgment replaces encounter. Categorization justifies emotional distance. 6. The irreversibility doctrine. You ask, if something hurtful happened, do you believe relationships can recover? The answer: once I'm hurt, that's it. Notice the absolutism. No room for apology, no space for time, no capacity for repair. But relational resilience depends precisely on the belief that restoration is possible. A structure that treats emotional injury as permanent converts every conflict into a potential ending. 7. Mediation as sacrifice. You ask, if your husband tried to mediate between you and his parents, how would you feel? The response: so I'm supposed to just endure it? Here, compromise is interpreted as oppression. Adjustment becomes synonymous with self-erasure. But sustainable families require negotiated middle ground. If all compromise is perceived as victimhood, collaboration becomes impossible. 8. The utility framework. You ask, do you consider what benefit the relationship brings you? And she answers, if it doesn't help me, I don't see the point. When relationships are evaluated solely by personal gain, emotional loyalty weakens. Family is not always efficient. It is often inconvenient, sometimes irrational. Its value lies not in utility, but in continuity. 9. The shrinking response. As the conversation deepens, her answers grow shorter. Eye contact fades. The pace quickens. Where an open thinker elaborates under pressure, a closed thinker condenses. The deeper the question, the briefer the reply. This contraction is often more revealing than the words themselves. 10. The autonomy shield. Finally, when pressed gently about considering family perspectives, the answer arrives. Ultimately, it's my choice. Autonomy is a virtue in Western culture. Individual agency matters, but there is a difference between autonomy and isolation. When my choice becomes a closing statement rather than the beginning of discussion, it functions less as independence and more as a conversational barricade. Across all these patterns, one common feature appears. There is no language of process, only language of termination. A person open to adjustment expands when questioned. They differentiate scenarios. They explore contingencies. They tolerate ambiguity. A person predisposed to closure simplifies. They shorten. They finalize. And this is why the direction of response matters more than the correctness of the response. The real issue is not whether disagreements will happen. They will. The real issue is whether the default setting of the relationship is understanding, negotiation, adaptation, or discomfort, judgment, exit. If you are a parent thinking about your child's lifelong relational structure, this is not a trivial distinction. Marriage is not just a romantic bond. It is a long-term system of negotiated coexistence. And the ability or refusal to adjust will determine whether that system evolves or fractures. If this analysis helped you see relational patterns more clearly, consider subscribing, liking, and sharing with others who may be facing similar decisions. These conversations are not easy, but they are necessary. In the previous lecture, we examined how certain responses reveal a hidden trajectory, not misunderstanding moving toward dialogue, but discomfort accelerating toward closure. We said the critical question is not whether conflict exists. It is whether the internal structure of a person moves toward adjustment or toward exit. Now we move one layer deeper. The following patterns are more subtle. There is no dramatic declaration like, "I will cut them off." No overt hostility. No raised voice. And yet, when relational tension rises, the internal mechanism quietly shifts to one option: close the door. These are structural signals. 1. When emotion becomes the Supreme Court. You ask, if a difficult situation arises with your future in-laws, what would you use as your primary standard for judgment? She pauses thoughtfully and answers, in that kind of situation, my feelings would matter most. At first glance, this sounds psychologically healthy. Western culture rightly emphasizes emotional awareness. We are not stoics of the ancient world suppressing experience. But here is the philosophical tension. There is a difference between acknowledging emotion and elevating emotion to final authority. If how I feel becomes the ultimate court of appeal above context, above intention, above long-term relational goals, then emotional discomfort quickly becomes relational verdict. The question is not whether feelings matter. The question is whether they are the only judge in the room. When this phrase repeats, my feelings are what matter most, it often signals that discomfort itself is enough to justify withdrawal. 2. The fixed boundary between my people and others. You ask, when you relate to people, do you tend to distinguish between those who are your people and those who are not? The answer comes without hesitation. Yes, I clearly separate my people from everyone else. This reveals a binary relational map. Inside, outside, safe, unsafe, mine, not mine. Healthy individuals create boundaries. But in long-term family systems, boundaries must also be permeable. Relationships evolve. Strangers become trusted. Distance can shrink. When the line between us and them is rigid from the beginning, expansion becomes unlikely. In-laws, by definition, begin outside the original circle. If the circle is sealed, integration never truly occurs. 3. Outsourcing the conflict. You ask, if conflict arises with your in-laws, who should handle it? And she replies, that's something the husband should deal with. Notice what has happened structurally. Instead of direct relational engagement, a buffer is installed. The spouse becomes insulation, absorbing tension, so that direct negotiation never happens. In systemic terms, this creates triangulation. Conflict is not resolved, it is rerouted. While mediation can be healthy, a refusal to participate directly suggests something deeper. I prefer distance to dialogue, and distance over decades hardens. 4. The refusal to explain. You ask, if misunderstanding occurs, how much explanation do you think is necessary? She responds, do I really have to explain everything? If they don't understand, that's on them. This statement carries a philosophical assumption. Understanding is the other person's responsibility. But in durable relationships, explanation is not humiliation. It is investment. To clarify is to extend a bridge. When explanation is perceived as burden rather than contribution, the bridge remains unbuilt. Misunderstanding then becomes justification for retreat. 5. Emotional cost as disqualifier. You ask, if the relationship becomes emotionally draining, what then? The reply, I avoid relationships that consume too much emotional energy. This language reframes intimacy as expenditure. Certainly, chronic emotional abuse should not be tolerated. But ordinary family friction is not abuse. It is complexity. If emotional effort is interpreted primarily as cost rather than growth, then long-term relational endurance becomes unlikely. Marriage is not emotionally efficient. Family rarely is. 6. Judgment without narrative. You ask her to describe a past conflict. Instead of sequence, you receive evaluation. That was rude. That wasn't normal. But there is no description of process. No timeline. No acknowledgement of escalation or misunderstanding. Only verdict. When a person speaks only in judgments, not narratives, It suggests a pattern. They are more practiced at labeling than at analyzing, and labeling closes the case quickly. 7. Independence as shield. You ask gently, "Do you see yourself as someone who doesn't rely much on relationships?" She replies, almost defensively, "I've always been fine on my own." Independence is admirable. Western culture celebrates autonomy, but independence can also function as insulation. If relational bonds are treated as optional enhancements rather than essential structures, the motivation to repair them diminishes. "I'm fine alone" can be strength. It can also be an exit strategy. 8. Viewing endurance as irrational. You ask, "How do you feel about people who stay in relationships despite recurring conflict?" She counters, "Isn't it stranger to stay entangled over something like that?" Here, endurance itself becomes suspect. To continue engagement despite friction is reframed as irrational attachment. But the history of human civilization extended kin networks, multi-generational households, long marriages, suggests something else. Durability often requires tolerance. If persistence is reinterpreted as foolishness, then termination becomes the logical choice. 9. Privacy as rapid closure. As questions deepen, a phrase appears more quickly. That's private. Boundaries are necessary. No one is obligated to expose everything. Yet when the threshold for private lowers, as relational topics approach the core, what we see is not protection of dignity, but acceleration of shutdown. Dialogue narrows. Exploration stops. The door closes earlier each time. 10. The immutable standard. Finally, when asked whether long-term family life may require adjustment, she concludes, "I don't think I would change my standards." This is the most revealing signal of all. Principles matter. Values matter. No one should abandon core integrity. But in marriage, especially within extended family, systems negotiation is inevitable. If personal standards are declared permanently non-negotiable in every context, then flexibility disappears. And without flexibility, stability becomes fragile. Across all these patterns, one philosophical thread runs consistently. Conflict is not perceived as a shared problem to manage. It is perceived as a personal inconvenience to avoid. The language may be calm, even sophisticated. The vocabulary may include words like boundaries, self-respect, mental health, efficiency. But as the questions deepen, the direction becomes clear. Does the person expand? Do they differentiate? Do they imagine repair? Or do they compress, simplify, finalize? In interviews, the danger is not one isolated answer. It is repetition. When responses repeatedly, quickly, and predictably move toward distancing, disengagement, or immutability, we are not observing a single preference. We are observing a relational operating system. And that operating system will not activate only with in-laws. Over time, it may extend to spouse, to children, to anyone whose proximity generates friction. There is a saying, you can rebuild a house if it is poorly constructed. But if a marriage is built on the wrong structure, you carry it for life. A house can be renovated, but relational architecture, once hardened by years of patterns, becomes far more difficult to reshape. All the warning signs we examined share one core assumption. Conflict is not something we manage together. It is something I escape alone. So the crucial observation in any serious conversation is this. As questions deepen, does the language of adjustment increase, or does the language of closure accelerate? In our next lecture, Daughter-in-Law Interview, Part 3, we will explore why these same distancing patterns often originate in a person's family of origin and how they tend to repeat across generations. If your child's marriage may shape the emotional climate of your family for decades, this is not a minor matter. Join me in the next session. And if today's analysis clarified something important for you, consider subscribing, liking, and sharing with other parents, navigating the same weighty decisions.